So thanks for coming. I wanted to give a talk about ecosystem restoration because there's a lot of interesting things that are happening here in Superior right now, and I think that that are happening around ecosystem restoration, around trying to create food off the desert, around regenerative agriculture. And I think if we better understand some of the principles of ecosystem restoration, some of the deeper concepts, that we can be more successful in those and get them done the right way. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is talking a little bit about some deeper concepts. The first thing I want to really jump into here is the concept of indigenous, and I want to be clear that I'm not talking about indigenous peoples so much as indigenous practices. And I have a tendency to they have officially declared that we are in the Anthropocene. That is the ecological time period that is characterized by human beings as a keystone species. And my attitude tends to be looking forward. And if we're going to be in this era, we have already, by some estimates, we've already been there for a couple hundred years. Then I think that we need to really lean in and be that keystone species. And indigenous practices are really an important part of that. Indigenous practices are defined by a group of people where for generations they've been living sustainably off of the land in a particular area. Now, indigenous practices are going to vary significantly from area to area. Even say between here in Superior and Prescott, you're going to see potentially different practices. And so I think that learning to follow those practices, like cobbling together some sort of a way of following those practices, is going to be really helpful. The problem is we're going to kind of have to do it on hard mode because, number one, we have the whole colonization practice that has actively and aggressively deleted as much of that knowledge as they possibly can. So at this point, best case, we're going to get kind of patchwork. So we need to kind of find whatever information we can, paste it back together, and then kind of move forward from there. Because I think really what we need to be is more like I said, living on the land like indigenous people. The second problem is that the colonization practices that we've been operating under for the last 100, 200 years have done considerable amount of damage. So if we were to go back in time, say 500 years, and talk to the people who were indigenous to this region and say, hey, what were the practices? Learn how to do those, bring them forward in time, they're probably not going to work. For one thing, Queen Creek was probably flowing as a perennial stream at that point, and it isn't anymore. So we're going to have to actually repair the ecosystem back up to a point where those indigenous practices are going to work. The other piece that's going to be a little bit tricky, I think, is understanding that we have a whole new biome ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, to be indigenous to, and we haven't had indigenous people in that space previously, and that is urban. I think that we need to, like, urban areas for largely have been kind of parasitic on the rural areas, where we let the rural areas grow the food, bring it into the urban areas. But that's becoming increasingly untenable, and we need to be able to create our own food in urban areas. And by urban areas, I don't just mean big cities. I know that Superior is really classified more of as a rural community, but from a standpoint of an ecosystem, if you can't have a couple of cows and some chickens on your land, you're probably in an urban area. So it actually definitely qualifies. The other concept I want to talk about is, what is an ecosystem? And I think that the thing to really realize is that ecosystems are unbelievably complex. I think it's probably not a stretch to say that there's probably not anybody who fully understands the operations of an ecosystem, because we're talking about trillions of interactions among billions of organisms, even just in your own backyard. And there's a lot that's going on. You have predation, you have parasitism, you have nutrients that are cycling from one organism to the next, you have energy that's cycling from from one organism to the next. But the cool thing about ecosystems is you don't really need to understand all of that because it's a self-organizing system. It's something that you just kind of point it in the right direction and it'll create itself in the right ways. What you need to do is you need to understand how to tune it. And I use as an example the console that's right over here. So if you were to crack this thing open and you aren't an electrical engineer and you want to reverse engineer, you're going to see all kinds of wires and circuit boards and all kinds of stuff on the inside, and it's really hard to understand that. But you don't really need to understand the whole thing. You just need to understand what the dials do. And that's kind of what we're going to work on doing here with an ecosystem, is what are the dials and how do you tune them and how do you make the whole thing work. So exactly. You have lots of inputs and outputs. Exactly. So this is kind of a diagram that you see in a lot of, if you took high school biology, you probably saw some version of this. And so basically what you've got is the way this is usually created is from, like, say, a maturity standpoint. So if you have ecosystem damage, then you're going to be over at the far left on this diagram. And as the ecosystem repairs itself, as it matures, it's going to move towards the left. Now, in a desert area, we're never going to get to like a boreal forest. There's just not enough water here for us to ever get there. So our goal really needs to be probably around here someplace. The important thing that you need to recognize about this particular diagram, though, is the productivity of the ecosystem. So if we're looking at creating food forests, if our deserts right now are at the extreme left, and that's not a terribly productive place for food production. There's not a lot that grows there. One of the good examples of how to tell that you're at the far place of that is what are called a crust. I'm drawing a blank on the name, but there's a crust on the soil. And so if you go out into the desert, find a place where the plants are 6 inches to a foot apart, take a pocket knife or a stick and dig into the soil and just kind of pop it up. What you'll find is the surface of that comes up into what's called a biotic crust. And that crust is kind of a hard capping on the soil. Now, if you go in and talk to people in conservation circles, in hiking circles, they're going to say, stay on the path, don't break the crust. The crust is really important. It's an ecosystem. The problem is, it is a functional ecosystem, but it's functioning at this level all the way down here. Basically, what that biotic crust does is it stops erosion. Unfortunately, the other thing that biotic crust does is it stops water infiltration. So when water hits it, it's a hydrophobic surface, and like if you go out into the desert after a rain and you crack that crust, you're going to find that the water has sunk in maybe 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch. So what's called effective rainfall, where the rain hits the ground and it soaks in and it refreshes the groundwater, that does not happen with that biotic crust. So what we really need to do is figure out how to move that ecosystem towards this direction. So we've got annual weeds and grasses, perennial grasses, and forbs. Forbs are just like broadleaf. It's a nicer term than weeds. And then woody shrubs and ecotone. I don't know what ecotone is, but and then we're really not going to get into this big forest kind of thing. So we're kind of looking in this direction. So the first thing that we really need to deal with is water. So one of the things we need to understand is that water is going to be a huge limiting factor in the desert, and it is not viable to pump our groundwater to water the desert to try and fix it. That's not ever going to work. We're going to run out of groundwater before we make any significant damage, and then we've really shot ourselves in the foot. It's not a sustainable solution. The best thing that we can really hope for is if we're actually capturing the water that's coming to us, and repairing the water cycles. And I want to talk a little bit about the water cycles that are really kind of relevant to this. So there's the large water cycle, which is water evaporates from the ocean, it comes inward, it rains, it flows back to the ocean. And that's the one we always learn about. But there's also a small water cycle where you have, the grasses will draw the groundwater up, water evaporates, you get enough of that, it builds up, and then it rains again. And it may not rain in the exact same place, but if you really want to break droughts, what you need is to repair the small water cycle. And so that's one of the big things that needs to happen. So in terms of capturing the water that's raining and getting it down into the ground, there's a number of different ways to do that. The first one is going to be catchment basins. That's a pretty common method. So basically what you've got a hole. Sometimes it's often a shaped hole. If you're coming down a hill, maybe you'll do little scalloped ridges that'll catch the water as it's coming down the hill. One of the real common projects that's doing this right now is they call the green belt, I think it is. I've drawn a blank. But what they're doing is it's in the south end of the Saharan desert. They're doing it all the way across Africa. There's a number of countries that are working on this. And basically what they're doing is they're digging these big holes in the ground, just pits. And so when it rains, the water settles into the holes and it stays there until it can soak in. And it's been working pretty well. We'll see. They just kind of started it maybe 10 years ago, and it's a really big project. So the check dams is the next one. So a check dam is something that's going to work in an actively flowing stream. So what you do with a check dam is some way, whether it be a rock dam across the stream or brush in the stream that's a beaver analog that basically slows the water in the stream down again so that it can spread out and soak into the ground. It has a little bit more time to soak into the ground. Berm and swale is I was going to say on the check dams, there was a project that I heard about maybe a couple decades ago that they did down in South America. I want to say Patagonia or something like that, where they had a stream that was coming down a mountainside, and all of the communities down the stream really needed water, and it was just rushing down all the way to the bottom. And so what they did was they put all of these check dams down the stream, and the guy at the bottom was like, "Hey, that's my water. Those are my water rights. Who says that you can steal my water and take it from me?" And what ended up happening was that not only did all of these communities down the stream have access to water, but what they found was that there was enough water that was soaking into the ground, it was replenishing the aquifer, that the water flow at the bottom didn't actually diminish at all. It just gave everybody, it was an abundance thing. There was tons of water for everybody. So the berm and swale is one that's a little bit like the catchment basins. A berm is think of like a little mound, a linear mound of soil. Swale's a ditch. And so what they'll do a lot of times is they'll put these along the contour lines on hills. And so the water, as it's coming down the hill, it catches in the swale and is stopped by the berm. And so the water will basically be held there. If there's enough water, it just overflows and gets captured by the next one. And again, the idea is that we're gonna hold that water there long enough for it to soak in. So one of the things that you'll see about those first three is that they all have two very important characteristics in common. Number one is that they're exceptionally labor intensive. You've got to do a lot of groundwork, you've got to do a lot of earth shaping, and if you have a lot of sediment moving, then you're going to have to, in a place that's prone to erosion, which a lot of our desert soils are, then you're going to actually have to maintain that by digging them out periodically. The second thing that they have in common is that the whole point is to slow the water down, just to try and get it to soak in, which is a challenge when you have those biotic crusts. The last one is where it starts to get really interesting. If you can increase the soil carbon content, then it'll actually help the soils to absorb the water faster. So increasing the carbon content in soil is like creating a sponge. So I'll throw a number at you. If you increase the soil carbon content by 1%, what you'll find is that you have an ability to absorb an additional 20,000 gallons of rainfall per acre per rainfall event. And that really does some absolutely magical things. It actually, it'll do that without creation of all of these firms and you know, the earthwork type stuff that we're looking at above. So I mean, if it's on a really steep hill, it might be a little bit less effective, but anything that's even remotely flat, that water's just going to hit the ground and it's going to soak in. In fact, what happens even more is as you start getting that water soaking in there, you'll get more vegetation, and then the vegetation will serve to slow the water down for you. So that's definitely an interesting result of that.
About that.
Yes, sir.
Slide, the top one. That reminded me of that time that I went with Miracle to the symposium in Ajo. And they do the same thing where they make the bowl.
Yeah.
But they actually lined it with like a bed liner, plastic.
Yeah.
And that's how they gather the water because of the heavy drops in that area. And then from there, periodically they'll let loose water into
and that would be
vegetations like for mesquites to grow and all that.
And that's more of a common issue when it comes to like someplace in urban areas where you have a lot of human interaction, where you're going to capture the water and hold it. But if you're out in the desert, you really you're going to more want to capture it and then get it soaked into the ground and get it there. But yeah, that's absolutely. There's a lot of cool ways to do rainwater catchment. I bet you could. So talking about soil. So if we're going to be looking at the soil, then let's talk about some basic. Now, soil biology is definitely something we could teach, honestly, entire college courses on, entire college degrees on. There's so much to it. But I want to talk about a couple of basic concepts. The first is soil biology. So it's one of the important concepts is that soil is alive. In fact, it's so effective at being alive that it's actually you could almost call it as a single organism. So I use the analogy that I like to think of is that if I look at my body, I am composed of all of these different tissue. I've got skin, I've got brain, I've got bones, I've got muscles. And those are all different organs that have different functions, but they all have the same DNA. Soil kind of works the same, except that it's the different organs have different DNA. So the different organisms in soil are all working together to create this vibrant community that's really effective at creating plant growth. We just need to give it the tools that it needs. The second piece here is the fungal to bacterial ratio. So on the fungal to bacterial ratio, you have there's two primary organisms in the soil. There's the bacteria and there's the fungus. And the fungus exists as these cottony threads. If those threads get broken up or disturbed, it kills the fungus. And sometimes it can take decades for it to return. So if the fungus isn't there, you'll get these bacterial communities that they'll change the pH, they'll change the available nutrients. And there are certain organisms that like that. And as the soil repairs itself, the fungal networks will reestablish. They'll suppress some of the bacterial activity, and it changes to different organisms. Now, if you look back, I was going to go back, but my computer's moving really, really slow on picking up slides. So just picture that ecosystem chart that I had before. That chart is a direct correlation to fungal bacteria ratio. So if you look at the far left where you have the weeds, that's a fungal to bacteria ratio of 0. The far right where you have the big tall trees, that's more like a 200. That's old growth forests. And so if you have the place that we're going to be looking at, the sweet spot is where it just slightly becomes fungally dominated, so a fungal to bacteria ratio of around 1. That's kind of where that's where you start getting to in a healthy desert, in a healthy grassland. So the other piece is carbon content. So the carbon in the soil, so there's two different kinds of carbon in the soil. There's labile soil carbon and there's stable soil carbon. Labile soil carbon is stuff that's going to break down. So it's decaying organic matter. So we're talking leaves, wood chips, branches, manure, stuff like that. You put that on the soil, it feeds the soil organisms, but it will almost completely or almost completely decompose. The carbon that's in there will eventually be returned to the atmosphere. That's just kind of how that works. But while they're there, they feed the microorganisms. The microorganisms feed the plants, and then the plants, what they're going to do is they're going to create what are called root exudates, and they're going to pump chemicals into the soil that create certain chemicals and biological communities that the plants need to survive. But in the process, that's what creates the stable soil carbon. So stable soil carbon is what makes topsoil topsoil. And the single biggest component of that is a compound called glomalin. And so glomalin is a soil glue that's made by what are called mycorrhizal fungus on the roots of living plants. And this glue binds the soil particles together in a way that it creates a crumbly texture to the soil that is habitat for the soil microorganisms, but it's also a texture that allows water to infiltrate. It allows roots to penetrate. So it's called tilth, and that tilth is really, really important to ecological communities. In addition to that, the glomalin opens up the pores, so it allows water to infiltrate. Once the water has infiltrated, it allows the water to, it helps the soil hold the water so that it doesn't evaporate as fast. And it increases drought tolerance, it increases salt tolerance, it cycles nutrients, especially nitrogen, it binds heavy metals, it sequesters carbon. There's a ton of stuff that it does. It's really important. If we can get more glomalin into the soil, that's a benefit. The problem is, once you create ecosystems, if you rewild an area, it can take 100 years for it to restore the glomalin. If the ecosystem is healthy, one of the nice things about regenerative agriculture is it has the ability to shorten that time down to 2 or 3 decades. So getting that glomalin in is definitely a challenge. So in terms of making the soil, we've got a couple of different practices that will help with that. The first is mulch. So if we take the biomass, so we're talking dead grass, we're talking leaves, we're talking wood chips. If we trim the branches and we grind them up and we spread them out as wood chips, the big important part is that we want that biomass to actually make contact with the soil. And once it does that, it starts to get decomposed by the microorganisms. The challenge that we're going to have in desert environments is a lot of the soils are in an exceptionally degraded condition. So there's not a lot of organisms there. So if you feed them, it can take years and years for that biomass to break down. The second piece will be compost. So compost is we take some of that biomass and we break it down in an active compost bin. That's going to reduce some of the fuel for the organisms to eat, but it's going to proliferate those organisms really, really effectively. And I think that, if you add that, it's still going to be more food for the organisms. It's going to be more organisms that are going to help colonize those desert soils and help them thrive. And I think, honestly, one of the best things that we can do is add a layer of compost and then add a layer of mulch on top of that. Yes?
Do you have an ideal ratio of, say, like brown to green to kind of thing?
In terms of just mulching, it's usually going to be just browns. In compost, it's whatever composting method you're going to use.
Depends.
Yeah, it depends. So by adding compost, I mean that we're not composting on site, because you would need to kind of turn that. That would be more mulch if you're adding it like that. So in the case of compost, you're looking at running a compost bin the way you would normally run a compost bin, and then taking the finished compost out.
I see. And if you're doing a bin in the desert, do you need to kind of tweak like the ratios?
The big thing if you're going to do a compost bin in the desert is just making sure you've got enough water to it. I mean, a compost bin to work right really needs, it needs the right ratio of greens to browns. So you don't really need to change that. That's going to be the same. It needs water, which you'll have to add a lot, and it needs heat, which is pretty readily available here in the desert. So that's not too hard. So the last one is, I think, the more interesting piece. So animal impact has the ability, if you get the animal impact right, it has the ability to really enhance the way that we can add compost to this, or get carbon into the soil. So the person I'm going to tell you a little bit about, Alan Savory. So Alan Savory is a biologist from Africa, and he's probably in his 90s now, and he started trying to understand early in his career why the deserts of Africa are the grasslands of Africa are all turning into deserts. And as he kind of expanded his scope, he realized that the reasons they thought this were happening are different reasons, but pretty much everywhere we have people, we're turning grasslands into deserts. And like the Sonoran Desert isn't naturally a desert, it's a grassland. It's just a very heavily degraded grassland. So it's something that we certainly have the same problems going on here. And what he found through his study was that the important piece is animal impact. So what you need is the hoofed ungulates interacting with the grasses on a very specific way, which that way is basically they come in, they graze, they move on. So while they're there, their hooves are going to break up that biotic crust. They're going to drop dung. They're going to drop urine. They're going to remove the top cover. They're going to bump the seed heads that are there and knock those to the ground. They're going to cover them up as they move around, and then they're going to eat whatever's available, and then they're going to move on, and then you need time for the ground to recover. It's what's called rest. And that process of rest and recover has the ability to pump large amounts of carbon into the soils. So one of the biggest generally accepted method for sequestering carbon in our soils is a forest. So a forest typically has the ability to sequester about a ton of carbon per acre per year. And that's kind of like most of our technological methods are still in development. They're not necessarily working as well as we would like. They tend to use a lot of energy. They're not overly viable at this point. So right now, what the most of the world would say is that's our best, is 1 ton of carbon per acre per year. What they find, they've been doing science on the process of holistic management that Alan Savory developed. They call it adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And what they found, the science has been coming in the last 5 or 6 years, and they're pretty consistent at about 2 tons of carbon per acre per year sequestered. So we're actually doubling the amount of carbon, but in a forest, of course, it's sequestered in the trees. In a grassland, it's sequestered down in the ground. So it's basically has the ability to kind of pump that carbon in there. Now, a couple of things interesting happened as he worked out the ways to do this and started experimenting. The first was that if you got the interactions right, it increased the amount of forage that was available, and within just 2 or 3 years, he found that he could double the size of his herd. And then sometimes a couple of years later, he could double it again. And in fact, Alan Savory is currently running a ranch in Africa. His property butts up on Dibangombe National Park, and he is running his cattle herds at about 10 times the size of what he originally was when he acquired that property. And even with that, he has more elephants on his property than the Dibangombe National Park has. So it's something that has created this incredible abundance that allows the natural wildlife to proliferate and thrive as well. But there's another piece to this that's really, really important for Arizona, and it was kind of a surprising effect. What happened was he found that after about 2 or 3 years of getting these interactions correct, what you'd have is those ephemeral washes. You know, you go out in the desert and you see a wash, and there's only water in it when it rains. So if it rains today or yesterday, there'll be water flowing in it, but not any other time. And what he found was after a couple of years of doing this process correctly, those ephemeral washes would flow the entire rainy season, just constantly. And then a couple more years later, he found that they were flowing several months after the rainy season. And within maybe 8 to 10 years, these ephemeral washes became perennial streams. And I think that's something that if we could get that interaction correct in more places in Arizona and start turning some of our washes into ephemeral streams, not only are we going to bust the drought, but we're also going to get rid of our water problems permanently. And it's something that is sustainable. We can keep that going.
Mostly with animals?
What's that?
Mostly with animals?
Yeah, with the animal impact, it's pretty important. So I wanted.
Go more into that.
What's that?
I'd love to go more into that, like who, what animals.
One of the things that I would very much like to do is, and I've talked about this, but we've never quite scheduled it. There's a fantastic documentary on this. There's actually several documentaries on it, Kiss the Ground, Common Ground, which are talking about this. But there's a really good one if you want to dig into the science called The Roots So Deep You Can See the Devil Down There. And it's a 4-part miniseries. I would love to have a viewing here if there was enough people who are interested in seeing it. It's created by a professor at ASU named Peter Bick, and they really dig into the science of it. It's really good stuff. So I wanted to dig in a little bit on a couple of the opportunities that we have to kind of employ some of these principles and ways that we might do it here. So the first thing that we've got is the Lear in Yards program. And basically what we're doing is we're continuing to build more and more Lear gardens in yards. And one of the really interesting things that a Lear garden does is it produces an output of compost that is a very different type of compost than anything else you'll see out there. And in fact, it's something that I think could be very helpful to this process. I call it Lear Soil Amplifier. Here at Regenerating Sonora, we call it soupy soil. It's the same stuff. So what happens is when we take the soil out, so we put in wood chips into the Lear garden, and while the plants grow in them, they're breaking down. And that does two things. Number one, back to the fungal to bacterial ratio, we get a high fungal to bacterial ratio. The compost is actually a fungally dominated compost, which changes the biological activity and makes it really powerful for ecosystem restoration. The other piece is that it's the only compost that you're going to find that has glomalin in it. Like I said, glomalin can take typically 100 years to produce. We can produce it in one, and we can produce it hundreds of times faster than what you're going to find in any sort of even with the regenerative grazing, we still are producing it faster. You know, one of the things, so one of the calculations that I've run, and we don't have necessarily like verified science, it's just a calculation based on the best numbers that I've got. But remember, a forest can sequester 1 ton of carbon per acre per year. A regenerative amp grazing pasture can sequester 2 tons of carbon per acre per year. If we were to build out an acre with Lear gardens, we could sequester more like 5 tons of carbon per acre per year. And one of the nice things about that is that carbon can then be distributed out and used to regenerate soils other than when it was produced. The other thing that I think is I wanted to kind of point to this little map of Superior. So here's Highway 60, and we've got this big, huge floodplain area that's unbuilt on, and I'm not sure exactly who owns it, but it's roughly 75 acres. If we were to, that kind of terrain would actually be perfect for goats. And if we were to do amp grazing with goats and find somebody to manage that and get a herd of goats down there, not only could we have more local goat meat, but we could actually start increasing the soil carbon in this area in a way that's going to increase the infiltration in our primary floodplain. I think the main reason that this isn't built on is because it's a floodplain. As we get big heavy rains and Queen Creek flows, it's going to spread out on that land. And if we were to increase the carbon content of that, we would increase the water infiltration that's coming down Queen Creek. So I think that would be a really, really incredible opportunity. But a couple of things that I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit in terms of specific projects. So we've got the Heartland trial at the Boyce Thompson Arboretum. And so the Arboretum is set aside 5 acres. It's unirrigated. It's in lowland. It's right next to Queen Creek, but we won't be messing with Queen Creek. But we've got some different drainage issues going on there that we can start using to capture and slow down the water. And I think that's one where it's not going to really be tenable to use on animal impact. I don't think the Arboretum would be for that, but there's certainly options to try and get rid of some of the overlying vegetation. They've certainly got kind of a grass problem, and if we can get some of those grasses mowed down and laid down on the ground as mulch, then we can start some of those processes of getting the carbon in the soil and mulching the soil and cooling the soil and all of those wonderful things that mulch does, and start increasing that soil carbon and in a way that's going to help us grow more. Of course, like I mentioned, the Leers and Yards. With the Leers and Yards program, we're going to keep building those Leer gardens and putting them in people's yards and harvesting the soil that's coming off of that. And that, I think, is a pretty significant opportunity in terms of just the sheer biomass of compost that we're going to be creating over the next several years. There's going to be a lot there. The Queen Creek wet restoration, this is something that the town is working on. I think that I don't know if it's going to be tenable to try to run livestock down in the basin around Queen Creek. That's something that we would have to talk with them. There's a kind of a big project. There's a committee that's formed around trying to figure out the best options. But really, they are interested in rehabilitating some of the wildlife down there, and I think it's going to be potentially a really, really interesting project. One of the other pieces that I've seen a lot of here is fire mitigation. We have a lot of that low-lying, shrubby brush that tends to burn really, really well. And so, there's definitely a lot of people that, certainly the public works director at the town of Superior. The Heartland trial has a guy who comes up from down a little bit farther down the hill. I don't remember exactly where he's from. I think Gold Canyon or something. Basically, they're very interested in fire mitigation. And so a lot of what they're doing is they're taking the brush and they're removing it. And I think that there's certainly some opportunities if we could get a big chipper and we could kind of chip that up and spread it out, get it down in contact with the ground where it's not going to be a significant fire hazard. I think that would be really helpful. We're already talking about making some of it into biochar, which biochar is exceptionally stable soil carbon that also helps the soil to absorb the water and hold its nutrients. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
What about goats?
Goats, well, for the
Animals where you...
Yeah, and actually, I think, I don't know if I meant to mention this, but if we're talking about the, running animals down in the basin there in those 75 acres, that habitat is absolutely perfect for goats. It's not cattle habitat, because cattle like grass, just straight grass, big open fields and lots of grass. But goats actually like it a little bit more shrubby, a little bit more rocky. They like woodier vegetation. And so they're really good for fire mitigation. In fact, there's a lot of places around the country and probably around the world where they have goats that will come in and reduce the fire danger. And so that shrubby vegetation, they'll climb their way through it. They'll even climb up trees to eat branches higher up. They're interesting animals. But yeah.
Yeah, you could bring goat corrals.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
exactly. So that's pretty much it for me. Any other questions?
Let's see.
what I got before I do.
Probably closer to 9 months.
Do another
Yeah.
planting, just,
Yeah, so basically what we're going to do with what's that?
would just as I come and
Yeah, so what'll happen with the Lear Gardens is Chris has got it on the calendar at 9 months. And so typically it happens between, so you usually can harvest it at 6 months, but you have to harvest it at a year, and which is why Chris kind of picked that sweet spot of 9 months. But basically what we're going to want to do is find a time right in there between planting seasons. So you've got one set of crops that are maturing and getting ready to be pulled out, maybe have a handful of plants that you would transplant, and we'll pull that out. Sequester anything that needs to be transplanted, take all the soil out, rebuild it with fresh wood chips, fresh topper, all of that stuff, and then we'll take that and sift it out and get it ready to, the wood chips, the stuff that's still wood chips just goes back into the next garden, and we just kind of keep rolling it forward. So, but that happens, about every 9 months, and so I think we're coming up on our first really Lear and Yards. Is coming up on a reset in maybe 2 or 3 months. I think we were October or November when we started that. So we're not quite there yet, but I think it's going to be really interesting once we start getting to the point where we're rolling through and we're having more and more of these gardens are getting ready to harvest the soil. We'll start producing. We're going to run into storage problems if we don't figure out how to sell it. So. We definitely need to find markets for it. You look like you have a question, Grant.
Let's see. If you had an abundant source of sawdust, what would you do with it? Do you think there'd uses for
Sawdust, I mean, you could spread it out on the desert. That'd be something. I mean, it'd be, depending on the texture of it, it'd probably just be prone to blowing around. It's a great one to add to compost.
you put it at the bottom of the compost pile.
Yeah.
Yeah, we use it human error.
Yeah. You do a lot of woodworking?
Well, we've been going to the Apache Wood Mill and over in San Carlos.
Apache what?
The wood mill.
Okay.
Over there.
Oh, okay.
And like we feel,
The compost that we get is actually from Eager, Arizona. They have a basically kind of a lumber mill there where they make telephone poles. And what they do is they take the trees and they grind them down to telephone pole shape, and then they take all that sawdust and they turn that into biochar. And I think biochar is honestly one of the better things. I forgot to mention it in the soil carbon section, but biochar is, in terms of how long it lasts in the soil. So glomalin lasts about 40 years in the soil. Biochar lasts like 400 years in the soil, or possibly even longer than that. And so it's something that, if we can add more of that into the soil, it doesn't create the soil structure like glomalin does, but it still helps open up the pores and allows more water infiltration and water absorption if we can get it worked into the soil. And actually, biochar is one of the things that we use in a Lear garden. So we actually, when we rebuild the soil structure, we add about 5% biochar, and then the finished product comes out. It's after everything's broken down and sifted out, it's closer to 25% biochar. So. And of course, the nice thing about it is that it's charged biochar. So biochar has the ability to absorb nutrients, and if you just put it in like empty and ready to absorb nutrients, it'll suck the nutrients out of the environment that it's in and cause some problems. But by adding charged biochar, then it's actually beneficial because it's adding nutrients in a way where the soil biology can get to them. So.
what's that place called in Eager?
Eager, Eager. It's next to Springerville.
Yeah. Is there a place?
I forget what the lumber mill's called. I've got their contact information if you want to talk to them. I don't know that they would want your sawdust. They produce their own.
Getting biochar. You buy biochar from them?
Yeah, they sell it in typically 1 cubic yard Well, I think they probably sell. They'd love to sell you a truckload of it, but they sell. Usually a cubic yard of it is $200 to $300, somewhere in there. So, anyway.